Embracing flexibility, the English opening immediately contests central squares and opens diagonals for future pieces. Developing a knight to its best square immediately challenges white's central control and prepares for pawn expansion. Opening the diagonal for the queen and preparing kingside development creates early pressure. Opening the bishop's diagonal sets up a flexible pawn structure, preparing for potential kingside development. Securing central space, white challenges black's flexible pawn structure and prepares for a queenside expansion. Pinning the knight offers immediate counterplay and challenges white's central pawn structure by creating a tactical imbalance. Provoking confrontation, this flank thrust immediately questions the bishop's central presence and prepares to gain space. Sacrificing the bishop here offers a slight positional concession, potentially weakening black's queenside pawn structure in exchange for eliminating a white attacker and opening lines. Doubling pawns like this opens the b-file for your rook, but weakens your kingside pawn structure significantly. Developing the queenside pawn creates a robust pawn chain, aiming to control central space and prepare for a queenside expansion later in the game. Solidifying the center and preparing a potential kingside pawn storm, though it does slightly weaken the king's diagonals. Developing the bishop to the queenside flank now, hoping to disrupt white's central pawn majority and control the long diagonal. Asserting central control and opening lines for your rooks dramatically reshapes the battlefield. Challenging the center directly, black ignites a sharp pawn battle and aims to free their queenside. Releasing the central tension opens lines and creates a pawn majority for white on the queenside, a key territorial advantage. Sacrificing the bishop like this opens up your kingside for attack, while giving up crucial development. King's safety now paramount. Securing the monarch's shelter is the immediate strategic imperative. Recapturing centrally reopens lines, but sacrifices pawn structure for immediate central control. Developing the bishop here aggressively targets black's central pawn and forces a decision about king's safety. Forcing a decision on the bishop pair and creating a potential weakness on the king side for black. Unleashing the queen to harass the king's sanctuary, this aggressive foray aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit the compromised king side. Reinforcing the queenside pawns builds a solid structure against the rampant white queen. Preparing to launch a kingside pawn storm while eyeing black's exposed king after that piece sacrifice. Liberating the e-file pawn, this decision urgently addresses the central pawn tension and aims to simplify the battlefield. Deploying the rook to the e-file, white aims to activate a major piece and contest central control, preparing for a potential pawn push or king attack. Ignoring the king's safety, black seeks to seize greater central space, a bold but risky gambit. Challenging the bishop's placement, this seeks to gain initiative and control over key squares. Instilling immediate central pressure, the queen seeks open lines for a rapid assault on white's vulnerable king. Fortifying the knight's central presence, this repositioning prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm while also safeguarding the e4 pawn. Breaching white's queenside pawns creates an active passed pawn, though it opens lines for white's rook. Concentrating queenside pressure, white aims to exploit black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. Sacrificing material for pawn structure and king safety is rarely a winning formula. Unleashing a pawn storm, white aggressively probes the kingside for weaknesses, hoping to pry open lines against an exposed monarch. Abandoning the pawn chain's integrity opens a perilous pathway for your king, creating immediate defensive liabilities. Uncovering black's king, this capture opens critical lines for immediate tactical pressure. Developing the knight to a more active square, this knight now eyes the weakened dark squares and supports potential central advances. Reasserting central control and preparing to dominate the open files, the knight finds an aggressive posting to menace black's queenside weaknesses. Securing the monarch via castling on the queenside creates a dynamic, potentially double-edged pawn storm scenario. Seizing the initiative, This knight transfer directly attacks the queen and targets unprotected pawns. Recentering the rook on the open file offers vital defensive support and prepares for potential counterplay on the central files. Securing the king's shelter from the encroaching queenside pressure. This cautious repositioning prioritizes pawn structure integrity. Capturing the knight breaks open lines, potentially exposing white's king, but also offers black a chance to simplify into a more active position. Opening the f-file creates immediate pressure on black's castled king and threatens to expose its defenses further. A vital defensive maneuver, reinforcing the weakened kingside pawns and preventing further pawn incursions. Initiating a counterattack on the queen side to challenge black's pawn structure, while keeping the king relatively safe. Seeking refuge for the queen from the assault along the a-file, but it exposes the king to future complications. Seizing the open file, white initiates a daring queenside raid, directly threatening black's vulnerable queenside pawns and king safety. Exposing the king further is an aggressive gamble. Hope for tactical disruption to compensate for pawn structure weaknesses. Repurposing the queen to conquer the open c-file and threaten black's isolated pawns. Regaining the material and simplifying, black aims to leverage the open files and activated rook. Suddenly, the rook becomes a potent attacker, forcing the king to flee and exposing its already compromised position. Sacrificing the rook for a pawn leaves the king exposed and the queen side permanently crippled. Securing the open, a file is crucial now, preventing the knight's return and solidifying territorial gains. Seeking safer shores for the beleaguered monarch, preparing for potential kingside advances. Activating the rook along the open file aims to seize the initiative, threatening to exploit the exposed king. Bringing the rook to the open file attempts to create some activity, but it might be too late to save the game. Initiating a decisive attack on the isolated queen's rook, seeking to exploit the vulnerable b8 square. Sacrificing the bishop for tempo allowed the rook to penetrate, but the king now navigates a perilous, exposed central area. Sacrificing the bishop to seize the open rook file is a bold, potentially game-ending initiative. Unlocking a vital passed pawn to challenge white's dominant rook exchange. Unlocking the queen's rook file offers a potent attack against black's fragmented pawn structure. Capturing the pawn opens a diagonal for the remaining rook, aiming for active play in the endgame. Uncovering the king with a fork, this tempo gain aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit the open files. Unleashing the rook along the open file demands immediate king vigilance. Repositioning the rook aims to secure the file and pressure the weakened queenside pawn structure.